think what we need to do as an industry is start communicating that like what our users are doing right now is they are sort of being the alpha testers of the financial infrastructure that we want the rest of the world to use. Um, and the risks that they're taking are sometimes just sort of plain old financial risk, but are frequently the risks of using like really complicated, hard to use systems that will send your money into nowhere and nothing at any given moment. Um, and I think we should do more, like, we need to sort of elevate this use case and these users as something more than just gamblers who are sort of speculating on all of our software. And if we don't do that, we basically get, we get pigeonholed into what have we built as nothing more than like elaborate gambling systems. And that would be, I think, a tragedy. So I think regulators have a lot of blind spots when it comes to this space. They view everything as a casino. When the reality is software only really starts to work when people start to depend on it. We can build all of these things in sort of self-contained little laboratories, and they will never become reliable and useful. And what we need is a population of people who are willing to like break and battle test things. So this is what I kind of view all the yield farming and airdrops and all of these other things that we sort of have characterized the sort of rapid expansion of this space over the last 2 years as kind of basically paying people for testing software. This is like the world's largest, most decentralized, most chaotic, like global beta test of a new financial system. And I think that's the way in which it needs to be understood, but we have not really ever made any attempt to communicate to people outside of this space that that's what we're doing here. That there is this like beta test going on of all of these new pieces of financial software, and that sort of the success or failure of that beta test has like positive societal consequences, because it like leaves this legacy of open source infrastructure that people can depend on. We are unfortunately sort of still, like, the status quo has been regulation through enforcement, which I think is an idea that like sort of circulates in crypto Twitter. But what this regulation through enforcement does is it means that like rather than as an industry we are engaging with the sort of regulatory infrastructure, instead it means that we have like this piecemeal interaction between various projects in this space that are each trying to find their like own individualized regulatory solution to whatever the perceived infraction is. And this has basically created like incredibly perverse effects in sort of how our industry is being shaped. Like, so like we end up in this world where there is like exclusionary criteria to basically like exclude people that are perceived as bringing with them too much regulatory risk, mostly Americans. But then those mechanisms are incredibly porous. So I mean, I think everyone in this, everyone in DeFi is familiar with like using a VPN to like access a user interface that you're not able to get access to with a US IP address. What possible, it's not really clear that this accomplishes like anything to try and like sort of like cut off Americans from the internet. But on the other hand, in a way that is like also very easy to get around. And so I think like what we have seen, like what continues to be the case is that like the interactions between regulators and the space in this sort of enforcement-driven mechanism has only the effect of like basically undermining the things that the space is trying to do, which is like the good effects of the space, which is trying to like expand inclusion in this like innovation process that we're all in, and have like a coherent, a sort of completely like sort of inclusive innovation process, while accomplishing like very little in terms of the sort of like comments have been made, as the ICO model was sort of put out, deprecated by regulatory action. Well, what did that do? It just created like a bunch of places for institutional investors to start participating in this space on a sort of unequal playing field, which has like long-term sort of secondary and tertiary effects in sort of how this space evolves. So I would say the biggest sort of thing that I think we should be looking for in this space is we should be looking for incentives from regulators rather than punishments. And we, to the extent that we are laying out a strategy of sort of resistance, avoidance, risk minimization towards regulators, there should be an openness to when the model switches from enforcement to like incentives to participate. Capital markets are not traditionally regulated through enforcement. Traditionally, they're regulated through like positive incentives, where complying with the regulations gives you access to like larger capital markets. And that is the sort of most effective strategy that has been sort of sketched out, that has been like the dominant way in which capital markets have been regulated for all these years. But we don't have that in DeFi. We have the opposite of that. We have a sort of complex, litigation-intensive rule-finding process where every settlement sort of unveils like a little piece of a picture, but it's not very clear that that puzzle will ever form a coherent whole. And so I think the main thing is that like I'm trying to say here is there are elements of the strategy that are like, we should make ourselves hard to regulate, but we also need to figure out a way to like sort of approach a more positive form of regulation when it comes. So we are not yet in this world where meaningful conversations are happening. We are still largely in a world where regulators don't understand what it is that we're building, and they have a very superficial understanding, like they don't understand like the difference between a user interface to a smart contract and like the ledger in which it runs on. But somehow we have to deal with this. So one of the things that I think is sort of important and is part of like sort of the guiding philosophy of Sommelier is that reducing trust is still key to managing regulatory surface area. I think it's important to go back to the like sort of origin of this space and Bitcoin, where Bitcoin was really, one of the things that was, so important about Bitcoin and why it was able to unlock so much innovation is the way in which it was able to, rigorously try to like reduce the surface area for trust, because everywhere there's trust, there is an opportunity for regulators to, regulators have a deep sense of like where these trusted things are, and those are the places in which they intervene, and certainly we've seen this with the evolved regulatory apparatus around centralized exchanges. But as we try to move beyond centralized exchanges, we still have to kind of go back to this idea of what can we do relies on trust. And so things that I think rely quite a bit on trust still are the user interface layer. When we're using all of these new tools that are existing, we are very reliant on sort of this like implicit software supply chain between like the original project creators and the website that they use to distribute the software that we use to interface with it. Most of us would not be comfortable just signing a transaction that came from any random place on the internet. We'd all realize that would put us all our money at an enormous amount of risk. And so I think that like one of the biggest pieces of sort of like one of the big missing pieces beyond these like kind of sort of like measures that various legal counsels for various DeFi projects will recommend, block all US IP addresses and stuff like that, is trying to figure out what our collaboration between wallets and DeFi protocols are going to be needed to really reduce the trust in the software supply chain. And so this is a little bit about sort of now, like how is Sommelier approaching this problem? So Sommelier is infrastructure for medium frequency DeFi strategies we call sellers. So you can imagine a smart contract that is doing something. There are examples later in the slide. So Sommelier is a platform for running complex DeFi strategies, targeting Ethereum as our initial target, eventually other blockchains. Our goal is to move away from trust in the protocol and trust in the protocol, trust in me, trust in the sommelier.finance website, and into the brand, into like strategists as like the representatives of our protocol. And we are trying to build a world in which users of Sommelier are both on the strategist side, the validator side, and then the end users who are putting funds into the protocol are kind of focused on sort of interacting with each other and not interacting with this thing that is Sommelier. And so this approach to trust minimization is sort of how we sort of are representing this vision that we have of like DeFi should rely less on trust. Sommelier can be perceived in many ways as an alternative to multisig. You could have a multisig that was like running your DeFi protocol and adjusting various parameters in your protocol, or you could have something like Sommelier, which has this like balance between strategists and validators that are acting as checks and balances on each other and sort of enabling less trust in any one sort of single and static set of parties. So as an example of like the kinds of strategies that you might be able to build on top of Sommelier, borrow lend strategies that dynamically optimize assets lent for yield, trend following strategies to hold assets based on social media and other metrics, stablecoin liquidity providing strategies that move between different stablecoins based on yield. These are the kinds of strategies that we're trying to make possible inside of the Sommelier system. And our approach to trust minimization is really to say, hey, there are validators who are running the Cosmos blockchain, who are sort of acting as gatekeepers between anyone who is managing any one of these strategies and the actual execution of trades. And the validators can like make decisions, like switching the strategist that is controlling any given smart contract. And so, as you know, this is sort of not entirely a Sommelier talk, but as you learn more about Sommelier, like we are trying to follow this practice of sort of reducing trust in DeFi. Cool. So I take questions. Last 5 minutes, if anyone has any. Yeah, absolutely. So the way Sommelier works is we have this is like 4 different pieces. So Sommelier has has smart contracts on Ethereum. The smart contracts at Ethereum are controlled by the gravity bridge, like the Cosmos to Ethereum gravity bridge. Then we have a Cosmos chain, which is sort of managing who the validators are, what are the strategies that are sort of registered, et cetera. And then we have these strategists, and so essentially that Cosmos chain is the multisig. And then we have strategists that are sending to the validators like sort of updates to different sellers. And those sellers will, so like if the validator set sort of authenticates that data feed, then the validator set like signs off and updates the system. And then we write the state back to Ethereum. That was a great question. Alex? Yep. The main purpose of the validator set is to like sort of regulate the sellers. Cool. I mean, the multisig is like, so the gravity model is like you have a multisig that like follows the Cosmos validator set. So it's like automatically updated as that as like people stake in and out of that validator set. Low latency. Yeah. Right now it's just multisig. It could be a threshold signature in the future. Cool. Their governance. Yeah. Yep. Soon. Cool. Thank you very much.
Test, 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 test. Is this thing on? Okay.